Aboriginal leaders have entered a week-long period of silence after the Indigenous voice to Parliament was voted down in Saturday's referendum. In today's episode, we unpack where we go from here on recognition and reconciliation.
We intend as a government to continue to do what we can to close the gap, to do what we can to advance reconciliation, to do what we can to listen to the first Australians.
As his dream of an Indigenous voice to Parliament faded, Anthony Albanese was gracious in defeat.
As Prime Minister, I will always accept responsibility for the decisions I've taken, and I do so tonight. But I do want Australians to know that I will always be ambitious for our country, ambitious for us to be the very best version of ourselves. I will always be optimistic for what we can achieve together.
The PM said the path forward won't be easy, but that he wants to work together on a solution. He said that the referendum and the debate that preceded it put the challenges being faced by Indigenous people firmly at the centre of our national consciousness. Indigenous Australians Minister Linda Burney tearfully acknowledged that the lengthy run-up was difficult for Indigenous people.
I know the last few months have been tough, but be proud of who you are. Be proud of your identity. Be proud of the 65,000 years of history and culture that you are part of and your rightful place in this country.
As the news sunk in, the reactions ranged from devastated to hopeful. Here's activist Tanya Hosh on the ABC.
Well, obviously still remain hopeful, because when you campaign for something like this, you hold on to hope until you're told that there is no hope left on the result. We were up against it from the start, and I'll be grateful for the number of people who did come out in strong support for yes.
Paul Kelly is the Australian's editor-at-large. He's been covering politics for 5 decades.
My main sentiment about Saturday's result is that it's a time to pause, to heal and to repair the country.
On the one hand, the result could be interpreted as a setback on the issues of representation, reconciliation and closing the gap. On the other, it could be the catalyst for monumental change.
The first point to make, and it's a really critical point here that leaders have got to emphasise very much in coming days and weeks, is that this is not a vote against reconciliation, it's not a vote against the Indigenous peoples, and it's not a vote against closing the gap. And I think the majority of the Australian public, whether they voted yes or no, want to see the divisions healed. In this sense, I think there's going to be a lot of pressure, despite the politics, on Anthony Albanese and Peter Dutton to try and rebuild a bipartisan basis for Indigenous policy. That won't be easy, it'll take time, but that's the fundamental requirement now.
Had it passed, the voice would have advised the federal government on issues that broadly fall under the closing the gap umbrella. Things like healthcare and life expectancy, access to education and the justice system. So what now?
Well, I'll tell you, the first thing we'll do is listen, continue to listen. We'll continue to listen and we will engage with those Indigenous Australians, treating them with respect.
I think the Prime Minister said the right things. He accepted the decision of the people. He made it clear that he does want to bring the country together again, and he signalled that new pathways are going to be required. Now, it's going to take some time to sort that out, and the truth is there is going to be acrimony and bitterness. That is inevitable, but the point about it is we will need the government and the opposition cooperating more and trying, I hope, to work together in terms of devising new policies. And this means, of course, practical action in terms of closing the gap.
Those big issues, healthcare, education and the justice system, are the purview of states and territories.
Well, it is up to the states. There's no question about that. I think there has not been enough pressure on the states in terms of addressing the problems. But here you've got to go to the Northern Territory government. There are many signs that the Northern Territory is a failed state, that as a government it lacks the capability, the resources, the finances and the will to address a lot of these problems. And in this sense, I think the role of the federal government has got to be critically important. And this comes back to the fundamentals all the time. Education, school attendance, employment, protection of families against violence. And I think it's very interesting that Peter Dutton and Jacinta Price have signalled that there's got to be a shift here in priorities away from what they say is listening to activists and academics and getting more down to the nitty-gritty and practical answers.
Many states, like Tasmania and South Australia, were in the process of formulating their own voices when the referendum came along. Those state-based voices would be legislated, meaning they'd be enacted by the government without the need for a public vote. So what becomes of those voices now that the concept has been rejected at the federal level?
The point I'd make about this referendum is this is a rejection of a national voice into the Constitution. Now, what are we looking at the state level is completely different. And I think there'll be some people who will want to argue, well, this idea is discredited, but I think, frankly, the Labor governments who are proposing voices at state level are likely to proceed with that. Maybe they might make some adjustments along the road, but I think they'll probably say, well, this was a national referendum about the Constitution and what we're doing is different to that. So I think what we're looking at here is that this proposal at the national level is certainly finished.
Paul says division among leaders on both sides of the voice debate has made it difficult to discern what the Indigenous community sees as the path forward.
One of the fundamental legacies of this vote and of the past 6 months has been the extent of division within Aboriginal leaders. And if this is ongoing, and I think it will be, then it will create a problem for the political parties and for broader Indigenous policy in this country if in fact we've got the Indigenous leaders disputing among themselves what ought to happen. The thrust now for Indigenous policy will be Indigenous policy outside the Constitution. More emphasis on practical results, and I think, frankly, that's obvious and that's necessary.
Opponents of the voice, like Jacinta Price and opposition leader Peter Dutton, have argued for months that it's not the most effective way to solve the challenges being faced by Indigenous people living in remote communities.
At all times in this debate, I've levelled my criticism at what I consider to have been a bad idea, to divide Australians based on their heritage or the time at which they came to our country. The Coalition, like all Australians.
So who's on the hook for alternative solutions?
Well, I think there is clearly an onus on the Coalition and Peter Dutton, but there's an onus on both sides of politics, government and opposition. But look, in terms of this referendum, we've got to go to the central issue about why this was defeated. The voice was a deeply flawed proposal. It was contentious in terms of constitutional principle. It was contentious in terms of governance practicality. This was creating a new chapter in the Australian Constitution, which has never been contemplated since Federation. Now, when you looked at this proposal by definition had to be contentious. It was clear that issues such as equality and race were going to be involved as a result of this proposal. And I think the extraordinary thing was that the government was not sufficiently alert to this, and having made the initial commitment, it was never prepared to revise its own thinking. And consequently, we ended up with a very bitter and divided debate, and the referendum being comprehensively defeated.
Coming up, the lessons we learned from a fraught referendum. Saturday's referendum was the culmination of a promise Anthony Albanese made in the first moments of his prime ministership.
The first time I spoke to you as Prime Minister of this nation, I repeated a commitment I had given many times before. I promised our government would seek to answer the generous and gracious call of those 440 powerful words through a voice, recognition enshrined in the Constitution.
The question now becomes what this defeat means for his political future. Here's Paul Kelly again.
History teaches us that referendum defeats don't mean the end of the Prime Minister who suffered the referendum defeat. So beware trying to translate this result into party political alignments, because that is misleading. The referendum is a very substantial leadership failure for Anthony Albanese. Now, what this means is that post-voice, people are going to be looking at Albanese's performance as Prime Minister on the big challenges that he faces. And here we're talking about cost of living, economic management, real wages, power prices, the renewables transition, living standards, national security. And Albanese will need to show that his failure on the voice was a leadership aberration, that it's not the new norm for Albanese. And of course, if his leadership looks vulnerable on these other issues, then people will say, well, look, the voice indicated not just that he had a problem with the voice, but he's vulnerable on leadership generally. So that is the challenge that the Prime Minister now faces.
So the referendum might not rule Albo out at the next election, but has he missed his chance when it comes to constitutional recognition?
Well, that sounds very logical, but it doesn't stand up. And the reason it doesn't stand up, as Anthony Albanese's repeatedly said, is because of the Uluru Statement and the position of the Indigenous leadership. The stance of the Indigenous leadership was really all or nothing. They said that there was only one issue for them. That was the voice. They didn't want the voice legislated. They wanted a referendum first up, putting the voice into the Constitution. They didn't want symbolic recognition. They didn't want any other proposal for recognition. So that was the situation that Albanese faced. Having said that, there's no doubt that Albanese is responsible for this failure. The referendum was his decision and was his responsibility. It will be seen to be an epic misjudgment. This, by any measure, is a humiliation on one of the most important referendums put since Federation. I think, given the vote, I don't think this would have got up even if it had been bipartisan. But one of the most extraordinary things here is the attitude of the Prime Minister, who clearly was prepared to put this referendum without any major effort to find bipartisanship. Well, that was a monumental folly.
And what of the opposition leader?
The referendum result is a substantial victory for Dutton. It consolidates his leadership. I think it shows that Dutton's forte is pitching to the sources of Australian conservatism, regionalism and suburban apprehension. But it suggests the Dutton Party, the Dutton Liberal Party, remains a forlorn force in the Teal-held former Liberal seats. And the Liberals have got to be very careful about thinking the no vote in seats held by Labor MPs can be translated into an election context, meaning a vote against Labor at the election. I think that would be a really false conclusion for the Liberals to draw.
The PM said on Saturday night that he won't pursue another referendum during this term.
I made it very clear that this was the only referendum that I was proposing in this term. I'm someone who believes that we need to restore faith in politics. And one of the ways that we do that is by saying what we'll do and then doing what we've said we would do. That is what we have done tonight. And I make no apologies for that.
But Paul says there are lessons to be learned from the way this referendum went down.
Well, in relation to the historic effort to have constitutional recognition of the Indigenous peoples, any such referendum now is many, many years away. And the reason for that is obvious, and that is that it'll be very difficult to get agreement on the form of such constitutional recognition after this. When it comes to other referendums, there won't be a referendum put on the Republic any time in the next 20 years. Remember, the tactical decision taken by the Labor Party was to put the referendum on the Voice before the referendum on the Republic, and there are always going to be consequences about that, and we can see what they are.
Saturday's result tells us a lot about how we vote too. The divide between Australians living in cities and regional areas couldn't be more stark.
This is getting further away from Sydney, and it's getting harder and harder to see yes votes. And then we get right out to the regions, and this has been the story across Victoria, Queensland as well. These regions, not only have they gone entirely no, but how high some of these votes have been.
People from migrant and multicultural backgrounds also voted against the Voice in large numbers.
Well, I think it reinforces one of the features of Australian politics and society that we've been aware of in recent years, and it's what I've called the phenomenon of the fractured nation. So we're seeing a loss of confidence in the governing parties. We're seeing more and more Australians voting for minor parties or voting for independents or voting for Teals. This indicates a degree of scepticism and lack of trust, I think, in the system, and I think it's not impossible to read this current vote in this referendum as reinforcing some of those trends. It is a problem in this country in terms of having effective governance and having a system of a reasonable degree of trust between the people and the government of the day.
Paul Kelly is the Australian's editor-at-large. Subscribers can read all our reporting and analysis of the referendum result right now at theaustralian.com.au.